Always remember the first rule of warfare. Enemy presumably do not pause to engage in casual genocide of primitive wards either. That's the first rule of warfare after all. When running from an enemy, don't go out of your way to make new ones. Who it might be nice not to go to war with. That is the first rule of warfare after all. Never pick a fight with someone bigger than you. And those older, tougher aliens were probably in a position to have seen all your previous interactions with other aliens, and could be in a position to swing by to tell you so. And you really don't want that. That's the first rule of warfare after all. Don't start fights with anyone bigger than you, or even the same size if you can help it. So the reality is, I've just never heard a convincing reason for invading an alien planet. Build up quite an army, one that grows stronger with each victory. Fighting self-replicating machines in space is a lot like fighting a necromancer. You don't ever want to engage unless you can win, because your lost troops stand right back up again and join in the attack. Now of course, the first rule of warfare is not to fight battles you'll lose. You are to encounter someone who finds your behavior loathsome and has the guns and willpower to encourage you to change your mind. That's the first rule of warfare: avoid recruiting for the enemy in civilian facilities. Since the first rule of warfare is to avoid making enemies out of friends, it is critical any nation wanting to build a military presence in space be able to demonstrate that capacity is constrained to minimize collateral damage, or passionately devoted to wanting you dead. After all, that's the first rule of warfare: pick your battles wisely. Be smart enough not to start stupid fights, which neither side really wants. And just as any sword can be beaten to a plowshare, any plowshare can be beaten into a sword. That's the first rule of warfare after all. Everything is a potential weapon. They do not, even if you could kick the snot out of them in a fair fight. Never fight fair. That's the first rule of warfare. In practice, only an idiot is going to openly attack a tank unless he has something much more likely to kill that tank than get himself killed while trying. That is the first rule of warfare after all: don't die, and serving as target practice is a good way to do that. Getting into a shooting match with a planet from orbit violates the first rule of warfare: don't get shot. That's the other side's job, which is best achieved by doing all your shooting from too far away for them to easily aim at you. One with Metamaterials trying to dissolve their boots while they're at it. That violates the first rule of warfare: do not create a hellscape for your troops to deal with before they even encounter the enemy. Also, that 10 Gs is just to avoid passing out while experiencing protracted acceleration or deceleration, while humans in car crashes often experience over 100 Gs and live or even walk away. The first rule of warfare is don't send your troops into battle feeling like they've just walked away from a car crash, possibly to the point that was more like an invasion by migration. That brings me to our first rule of warfare: keep your wars short. Don't plan a war with troops that start off as teens and end up fighting until they're octogenarians looking for an old folks. This gives us the first rule of warfare that every strategist needs to know. It is quality rather than quantity that matters. Ultimately, if you really want something dead, just remember the first rule of warfare: there is no such thing as overkill. It works well, and so does using multiple techniques. You blow everything up, gas the place, and then send in the mortar bots. Then you pave the smoldering embers over and build a giant monument to how vengeful you are toward your enemies, so that nobody else decides to poke their head up and take their chances at getting on your bad side. But over the past century, we have seen an increase in our ability to know where the enemy is to strike them or avoid them. Knowing of the enemy's locations and abilities is profoundly valuable. That's the first rule of warfare: know where your enemy lives so you can drop by for a visit. That's the first rule of warfare: train the way you fight because you'll fight the way you were trained. It is a sad reality that war is probably not going away anytime soon, and is likely to be a passenger aboard every colony ship we send out from Earth in the centuries to come. But often the best way to avoid a war is to prepare for it, and that is the first rule of warfare after all. Now, as everyone knows, Murphy's Law, that anything that can go wrong will go wrong, is the first rule of warfare, and that's doubly true of both electronic equipment and the battlefield. As I've mentioned before, you want to avoid using weapons that are likely to kill their user, and that's the first rule of warfare. The shared disadvantage is the whole own goal problem, where you get blown up by your own bomb, which violates the first rule of warfare: don't use weapons more likely to kill you than your enemy. But quantity has a quality all its own, and of course that's the first rule of warfare: always outnumber your opponent. Since the first rule of warfare is not to be an easy target and give your enemies high-impact, low-risk investments for their ordnance, standing around or even moving around in a big tight formation isn't a good idea. But of course, used properly, even a seemingly minor bit of new technology can let you dominate a battlefield. That's the first rule of warfare too: know how to use your equipment. While their major assets stay far further back and try attacks and maneuvers that are far less likely to succeed, but also far less likely to get them killed in the process. That's the first rule of warfare after all: try not to lose while winning. Pyrrhic victories aren't. After all, you should never hand someone a gun unless you know which way they're going to aim it. That's the first rule of warfare. They presumably think whatever they were doing was reasonably ethical, and we could be convinced of the same, particularly as they presumably have a lot of guns and very big ones at that. That is the first rule of warfare after all. The persuasiveness of your argument is directly proportional to how much firepower you have to argue your case. If this is not easy for you to do, then you are going to lose if you deploy attacks that are pointless overkill when your equally armed enemy is being more tactical with their expenditures. That is the first rule of warfare after all. Don't waste ammunition, you might need it later. For attacking spacefaring civilizations, what you want is a weapon that carries enough force to do the job, moves quite fast, and hits the target. That is the first rule of warfare after all. Shoot first and don't miss. And don't use a squirt gun, since there's precious little point in getting the first hit if all it does is irritate them. That violates the first rule of warfare: don't give gifts to your enemies, and doesn't even get the Trojan horse caveat, since while it is easy to hide your troops inside a black hole, you can't deploy them from there, except as Hawking radiation,